They see people like me and like Liz Cheney and like you who get sniped when you stand up alone. And they're like, well, gosh, I don't want to get sniped. Well, of course you don't. Nobody wants to get sniped. But I don't want to have to look in the mirror and think and talk to my 2-year-old kid someday about courage and doing the right thing, even when it's hard, and know that I was unable to do the exact same thing. Like, how can I say that to him?
So joining us now on Open Book is Adam Kinzinger. He's a U.S. representative for Illinois, at least the former U.S. representative for Illinois' 16th congressional district. He served in our Congress from 2011 to 2023 and is the author of a best-selling book, Renegade, Defending Democracy and Liberty in Our Divided Country. But I got to tell you, I'm a fanboy of yours. I'll explain why. I think that Jack Kennedy wrote a book called Profiles in Courage, and they were critical of that book in the 1950s. One of the journalists said to Kennedy, well, the book is quite slim. And he said, well, yeah, it's slim because it was very hard to find courage in the Congress. And that was Kennedy's quip and remark about that. And yet here you are at a seminal moment in our history where I think a lot of things are fracturing. And you stood up to President Trump. You stood up for the values of the American democracy and what once was the Republican Party. And so I'm a huge fan. I just have to say that up front, Adam, and appreciate you coming on. Congratulations on the book. How would you describe your political standing right now? Are we a dying breed? And you more so than me because you are a former elected official. I'm just one of those midnight warriors that got fired after 11 days.
Well, good to see you, buddy, and thanks for having me. And I appreciate you speaking out too, and thanks for the kind words. Like, look, are we a dying breed? I guess in a way, I would say yes, but like, it's not like we changed, and then our type of people always existed, and it's not like I guess some have kind of sold out to the Trump cult or whatever, but I don't know, man. It's like I think ultimately there's going to be a day when kind of normal thinking, I'll call it, comes back. I think it may have to take another loss or two for the GOP. Or maybe it's just this moment where like everybody's kind of ready for somebody to come heal the nation. They just don't know it yet. Like the country was ready for Trump to break the nation. It's just they didn't necessarily know it, and he kind of accidentally, hopped in at the right time. So I don't know, but I'll tell you, there need to be people like us out there. Otherwise, I don't see how this continues to succeed for the long term.
Well, for me personally, I have no political instinct, so I actually thought it was going to go the other way. I was 71 campaign stops with Mr. Trump, lifelong Republican, consider myself a moderate Republican. And I considered him a moderate because he was once a Democrat. He was agnostic to things like transgenderism and, abortion and things like that. He morphed. I guess you needed to do that to win the presidency. But Adam, what he was doing, which I respected, and I just want to get your reaction to this, is he was speaking to a class of people, a group of people that feel disenfranchised. We hollowed out, I've had Robert Lighthizer on this podcast for his book discussing our manufacturing policies and our trade policies. And people like the ones I grew up with were directly impacted by this. In fact, I told Mr. Trump that my father's wages, if he had the same union job today versus in the 1960s and 70s, the real living wages are down about 26%, which puts the Scaramuccis on the poverty line. It doesn't put us in the middle class, which is the way we grew up. And so I thought he was championing that. That was a vacuum that was left by the Democrats. They left that space. But it became distorted. It almost became like a Frankenstein monster where now we have all of this hate and we have all of this white supremacy nonsense and so forth. Did he cause that, or was that there and did it bubble up and he became its avatar?
I call him kind of the accelerant. He was the accelerant, right? Like, yes, it was always there. And I think you're right. There was a real particularly where I'm from, the Midwest, that just felt kind of left behind and ignored by the coastal elites. And it's a reality. And so he came along and he gave voice to that. And like you said, it was an opportunity for him to give like a voice to that fear and then use that like voice. If he was a better person, if he was an actual good human being, he could have used that fear and that voice to then point people to a positive future, or at least do something, to project a positive future. Instead, all he did was he allowed the fear to get out of control. And then he just continued to use that for his own benefit. There was no bone in his body that was about like making the country better. And, he took it personal when the Democrats opposed him on things. Well, that's what Democrats do when you're a Republican. That's what Republicans do when you're a Democrat. And he took that personally. So, but yeah, I mean, look, that is a real, if I was advising Democrats, and they don't really take my advice, but if I was, I would say you have to give voice to that fear of crime. That's a real issue. That's a real fear right now. Immigration is a real concern. I'm in Chicago at the moment, and it's like there's these tent cities that are popping up, and people are upset about that. And, give voice to that kind of feeling of hopelessness, but do it with a positive focus. And I'm not sure the Democrats quite know that art either at the moment.
Well, they've got their own level of insanity going on, right? I mean, they've got this whole unhinged wokeism that's driving everybody crazy. Andrew Cuomo, who I grew up with, the former governor here in New York, said to me yesterday, the exact quote, the 3 worst words ever uttered by a Democrat, defund the police.
Oh, gosh.
Okay. I mean, the 3 worst words, right? So we both know that we have craziness on both sides.
Well, can I say to that real quick?
Yeah, please.
What you'll hear is, and you'll probably see it in the comments and hear it from your friends. They're like, oh, the defund the police. That was like 3 people that ever said that and whatever, and it's not real. Okay. Look, I don't know, but I'm going to tell you the perception. If you want to have good advice, let me tell you, the perception is that you guys are all about defunding the police. So if you're not, then go out and aggressively go after this much harder. But if you're going to get mad at me for telling you what the perception is, well, that's on you if that actually does impact the election.
Totally true. I mean, that brings me to my next question, which I think you describe in the book. I'd like to have you describe it to our viewers and listeners. So what happened? Bob Dole once said that he may not have agreed with George McGovern, but they both served in the U.S. military during the Second World War, a result of which they had mutuality of respect, and therefore they may not have agreed on issues of policy, but they agreed on their love for the country and the sacrifices. And of course, in Dole's case, he was wounded in the war, the sacrifices that they made. So there was some level of comity, comity. What happened, sir? Why did we get to where we are right now?
Look, I think it's any number of things, but a lot of it is, finance and fundraising is so important in politics, and it just continues to, like every year it becomes more and more important. And I remember being, showing up in 2010 or 2011, I guess, when I was elected. And, at the time it was all about, you've got to do these big fundraisers. You've got to raise money from downtown, these PACs. You've got to, find the big donors. They'll throw fundraising events for you. Everybody needs to max out. The Democrats became really good at small dollar fundraising. And then the Republicans became really good at it. Well, what's the best way to raise money? What's the best way to keep eyes addicted to television or reading a certain newspaper? It's fear, right? It's if I have you convinced that you're going to die, and the only thing that can stop it is me. Like, you'd part with anything, even if you're on a fixed income and Social Security, you'd send me $10 if you think I can stop, Nancy Pelosi or whatever the demon is from destroying this world. And so that fear became addictive. And you can play with the art a little bit of fear in politics, but you have to know when to tamp it down. You have to know when to put that fire out. And I think what's happened is fear has become so profitable and fright has become profitable. And by the way, Anthony, the best way to actually get people motivated is not like fear of the Democrats. It's fear of somebody in your own ranks that's an apostate, right? That's you and I now. You and I are the rhinos. You and I are the ones that don't show sufficient loyalty to Donald Trump. And so some of these news organizations like to go after us the most because that actually drives the most eyes and drives the most fundraising. So I think it's all of it, but I think that's basically how we got to where we are, is just using fear and kind of a loss of this feeling that, look, as a leader, I have to actually put out some good news and good ideas for people. That's my responsibility. There's a loss of that feeling of responsibility.
All right. I want to go to my birthday. Okay. I'm born on January 6th. Can you imagine that?
Oh gosh.
Okay. So on my 57th birthday, there was what looked like to me insurrection or movement, a crush of the Capitol, an invasion of the Capitol. Actually, I think people's lives were under threat. You tell me if I'm wrong. Obviously, Tucker Carlson said it was a tourist visit and people were taking selfies and it was quite mild mannered. But it seemed like the Secret Service is moving Vice President Pence pretty quickly out of the area. So tell us your words about the attack on the Capitol. And you write in the book that you felt some sense of responsibility for it happening. So explain that to people. Explain that as well.
Yeah, so I think that the sense of responsibility, and is we have to, if we're gonna if I'm gonna put out a book about myself, for God's sakes, right? Which is a basically an arrogant thing to do. It feels very arrogant, but I need to be very clear about any role I played and where we are. And look, I was able to benefit from that playing with fire for a long time, right? Like our party would raise money and get votes based on that fear of Obamacare and death. I never talked about death panels, but I never stopped other people from talking about death panels, for instance, with Obamacare. And so it's like coming to recognize that, there were many more times I should have voted for the first impeachment. In hindsight, I'm glad I didn't, only because it allowed me to survive to the second one, but I should have voted for the first impeachment. And so I look at those kinds of things and I bear some responsibility for it. Probably not as much as most in my party, but I bear it. In terms of the actual January 6th, I mean, look, I predicted violence before January 6th. I get asked all the time, like, how did you know? And it was really easy. I looked at Twitter and I saw people threatening me. I saw what they were saying about what they were going to do at the Capitol. I recognized that the former president had convinced a significant amount of the Republican base that an election was stolen. And I know that, the American thing that we believe in, that we're proud of, is that we were born out of revolution. We were born out of this idea that, taxation only with representation. And I know all the base people that always talk about how the tree of liberty needs refreshed with the blood of patriots every now and again. And I knew what this was pointing to. So I show up that day. I took my gun to work, which I usually didn't take my gun to the Capitol. We were allowed to, but it was no reason, right? There's no reason to take it. I did that day. I asked my staff to stay home. My wife stayed home. And by the end of that, as everything was going down, it was so predictable to me. I ended up barricaded in my office, and I got to tell you, I'm a Christian, but I'm not one of these that says oh, I feel this evil around the corner or this darkness or whatever. But that day I felt just a real darkness that was coming down over the Capitol. It was just I don't know, dark cloud. That's the best way I can put it. And I ended up barricaded in my office. There was a point where I thought I may have to actually fight, people with a gun. And then by the end of the day, went down, gave my speech on the floor when everything was kind of tamped down. And I just remember being pissed off. I wasn't inspired by the survival of democracy or anything like that. I just remember being angry because 130 some of my fellow Republicans were still going to vote against certification of the election, even though they knew, as literally a body was still outside and glass was on the floor, they knew they caused that. But they didn't have the courage to then turn their vote because why? Because the most important thing ever is to keep your identity and keep your job. And that's what they cared about. And so it was a terrible day, but I say, look, we aren't defined by bad days. We're defined by what we do with those bad days. And I think that's the part of the story we're still writing, is how do we come back?
So Mike Johnson is somebody served with him. He's now the Speaker of the House. He didn't buy the validity of the 2020 election. Do I have that right, or what do I have wrong?
No, that's right. And I not only didn't he buy it, he actually led the effort. So the very first kind of sense that I got that we were actually going to do more than just go on the news and talk about a stolen election, we generally, not me obviously, but the Republican Party in general, was Mike Johnson came to me, because he obviously didn't know me that well, and asked me to sign on to this amicus brief to the Texas lawsuit, which would throw out the votes of places like Michigan. And I just looked at him. I'm like, Mike, dude, come on. You know better, and you know me. I'm not going to sign on to this. And so that's where I got, like, that was my introduction to him, really, was that moment. If you look at all the arguments that were made back then, so all the arguments against, like, the election or whatever, a lot of them cite the work of Mike Johnson. And when they're talking about, hey, this, I don't know, this constitutional amendment or whatever it was they were saying, it was always Mike Johnson said. And I think the scary part to me is I know he's a smart guy, and I know he doesn't believe the election was stolen. I know that because, like, he's smart.
Right.
But he's still willing to lie about it.
Right.
That just goes to show it's the end justifies the means kind of a person, which is frightening to me.
So let's get in the mind of not necessarily Mike Johnson, but you serve with a lot of these people. I have met members of House Republicans, and I've been a Republican fundraiser and a donor for almost 3 decades. And so they'll come into a small group meeting and say Trump sucks. And then they'll go out in the public domain and say Trump is awesome, And McCarthy, who I think is the definition of profiles and cowardice, not courage. True. He had Trump on the ropes on January 7th. He could have put him right through the ropes for what he did to the country, and yet he got nervous, and it passed, and he became an ex-president, and no one wanted to convict an ex-president, but they had him on the ropes. Him and McConnell could have convicted him, impeached and convicted him for what happened on January 6th. So what goes on? Tell me you deal with these people. What's refreshing about you is you're now one of them, but you were there with them. So what goes on in their minds? It's cool for them to say one thing and do another, and believe one thing but act in a different way than their beliefs. What is it about their DNA?
Part of the problem is, like, at those fundraisers where they do, like, Trump's insane, wink, wink, nod, nod, like, hey, I got, just so you guys know, I got to go do the Fox News thing and say, blah, blah, blah. They do that. And the problem is the donors basically let them off the hook. They kind of shake their head and like, yeah, you're right. I get it. And, that's why somebody like Nancy Mace can claim to be a moderate Republican and then go on Steve Bannon's podcast, because people can look at her and be like, oh, I get it. I get what she's doing. Like, I'll say this to any Republican donors: quit doing that. Like, start holding these people accountable. If they're going to tell you, yeah, Trump's insane, they need to go say Trump's insane out in the public, because otherwise that just shows they're complete cowards. So what happens is, they need to raise the money. They don't believe these arguments, but they see people like me and like Liz Cheney and like you who get sniped when you stand up alone. And they're like, well, gosh, I don't want to get sniped. Well, of course you don't. Nobody wants to get sniped. But I also don't want to I don't want to have to look in the mirror and think and talk to my 2-year-old kid someday about courage and doing the right thing, even when it's hard, and know that I was unable to do the exact same thing. Like, how can I say that to him? And so I think just what goes through their mind is an utter fear of losing their title, of being kicked out of the tribe. Because I've come to believe that people, more than they fear death even, they fear being kicked out of their tribe. They fear losing that title. And I think you have to finally confront that moment, and then you get a lot of courage. But until that point, it's like the fear of the unknown is worse than actually going forward and saying, look, I'm done with Donald Trump, right? Yes, you may lose your job in Congress. Well, guess what? There's a lot more money to be made, and you get to travel a little less if you don't stay in Congress. So it's actually quite a bit better.
But you don't, correct me if I'm wrong. You don't have that fear.
Not anymore, yeah.
You had it at one point?
I don't know. I guess, like, so here's the interesting thing, and maybe this was a God thing, I don't know, but when I came back from Iraq in 2009, when I started running, I remember consciously thinking, and then I even said it out loud a few times, is like, if we're going to ask young people to die for this country, if I'm going to take a vote, like to send people to war and, to outfit people for war, that kind of stuff, I have to be willing to give up my career if there comes a vote that is so important to the country that I have to take a vote that ends my career. And I just remember thinking about that all the time. So I think the fear was still there. Like, I never wanted to have to do that. I mean, I can talk about the times. Yes, I spoke out probably more than anybody against Donald Trump with some of the things he said and did, but there were times I didn't, and I should have too. But I think I just once it became clear to me that what was going on was going to define the rest of my life and be historic, a stolen election, that kind of stuff, the fear went away because at that point, my fear was just simply being seen as a coward historically. That was the biggest fear I had. So, yeah, I guess to an extent, everybody has fear. It's just which one's greater. And mine was the biggest fear was just to be a coward.
It's so well said, but I mean, so many people unfortunately don't think like that. Okay,
Right.
you served in Iraq. Uh, you're a courageous guy, so you get that from your parents. You get that from an inner voice. You get that from your family members that encourage you. Where do you get it from, Adam?
I guess I would say I get it from all of the things you mentioned. So, family, the inner voice, I think just like, okay, so training, whether it's as a pilot or, as a military member or whatever, training is all about, or let's say you're a police officer. Why do you go to the range and shoot? Because you have to be willing, you have to know what it's like to make a decision to shoot, and then you have to go through the motions of doing that. And I think for me, I just was always conscious of the fact that, I would have to make those decisions. And I think I trained my mind to be courageous, I guess, if you want to call it that. I feel uncomfortable calling it courage, but like train my mind to do the right thing. So I think that's a lot of where it came from. Obviously, great family, great upbringing, but like just always going through my head, like I may have to do this career ending thing. And it just made it likely I was willing to do it when that time came.
So, people seeking power today. And maybe it was always like this. It didn't feel like this when I was growing up. I sort of felt like the people that were seeking power when I was growing up had this great love for the country. I think again, George McGovern, Ronald Reagan, Walter Mondale. You can like or dislike their political views. James Earl Carter, Jimmy Carter. Again, we could agree or disagree on the success of his presidency, but it seemed like they were well intended and they were pursuing the public interest or serving the people. It appears now, and I'm wondering if Citizen United had this effect.
Yeah.
It appears now that the Congress can be bought. The big pharma comes in there, big food comes in there, lobbyists come in there. The men and women want to stay in power. They know they need money for that. And if you just look at the way the laws have been promulgated since Citizens United, they favor the very wealthy, and they don't seem like that they're being any way policies pursuing or helping the middle or lower class. What am I getting wrong? Tell me if I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, say you're wrong and here's why, because it's just an observation and it's my personal one. It's not empirical.
I think it's both because I think it's two things. So first off, I think you're correct. I think Citizens United was terrible for this country. I think I think we're in danger of becoming an oligarchy, right? So just look at Illinois. We had a billionaire Republican that was governor. So the Democrats had to recruit a billionaire, Pritzker, to run against our billionaire. And then in the last election, we tried to find another billionaire to run against Pritzker because we needed a billionaire. Right. So what's happening is the average person is being moved out of politics. Or if you're the average person that comes to politics without money, you've got to go find these sources. And exactly the people you mentioned are the ones that bring that source with them. I think the other thing, though, is, the most addictive drug out there, I'm convinced, is fame and popularity, even though it's a pretty hollow drug. It's pretty addictive. And I think politics with, like new media, the different way of doing things, the obsession people have with Washington, D.C. now, politics has become almost more than Hollywood in terms of fame. And by the way, you can actually make your own fame now. So if you want to become famous and you want to be in Hollywood, that takes a lot of effort and a lot of luck. If you want to become famous in politics, all you have to do, anybody can do it. You just tweet something outrageous and all of a sudden you're famous. And I think that drug of fame has been really bad for who we've attracted to politics. And quite honestly, I mean, who wants the normal people that are good people? Who would look at this and want to go in, right? Because it's just so bad right now.
Right.
That's a sad thing too.
Yeah, but I almost feel like they've done that on purpose. They've like created these ridiculous barriers to entry for normal people, and they're mudraking, and they don't want normal people to enter. Speaking of two reasonably normal people, I mean, at least by my observation and my interaction, are two governors, Chris Christie and Nikki Haley. I think that I think I've seen you express this, and you like both of them.
Yep.
Um, do they have any shot to get the Republican nomination?
I do
Either
think
of
there
them.
is. Yeah, I do think there is a shot. I prefer Chris Christie because Chris Christie tells the truth. Nikki, I like, and I think she'd be a great president. My only concern is I think she called this a witch hunt against Donald Trump, and I'm like, we just need more people to tell the truth that it's not a witch hunt, that Donald Trump is a witch, and it's just a hunt, right? It's not a witch
Right.
hunt, and
Right.
but yeah, I think look if you look at whatever the recent polling in Iowa is, I think Trump's still at like 45. And yet the DeSantis Haley numbers like 36 combined. Ron DeSantis needs to drop out. He has no future in this. But once and some of his support will go to Trump. But once either Haley or Christie start consolidating that second place position, then it becomes a discussion about Donald Trump or Haley/Christie. And then at that point, I think there is a chance that you could start seeing people consolidate behind one candidate. To the point right now, there's just still too many candidates in the field. I'm glad Pence got out. Nobody knew what Pence actually stood for because one day he was pro-insurrection, the next day he was anti. And but I do think it's not likely, but I do think there's a decent chance that one of those two could win. Plus, keep in mind, once he's in trial, once Trump is in trial and he's occupied, and then all the details of this stuff comes out, it's going to have an impact, regardless of what people think. It's going to have an impact.
Yeah, I don't know. I just super worry. You said that the country may need leadership or may not recognize yet that it needs this transformational leader. So let's make you Dr. Frankenstein and going to put you in the laboratory. What kind of leader would be acceptable to these different sects of the Republican Party and would still have some crossover appeal to moderate Democrats and independents?
Well, look, I actually think it would be take Chris Christie or Nikki Haley, and I think that's it. Because let's just take Nikki Haley because she's relatively unknown compared to Chris Christie, but I think they both would have this appeal, which is I think the Republican Party would, even the most hardcore Trump supporters, once he's out of the picture, it kind of would revert back to an extent to the old Republican Party. Not the old party, but they have nowhere else to go. Maybe they go to Kennedy Jr., who knows. But I think somebody like a Nikki Haley or Chris Christie that has been a governor that knows how to work with the other side. This is Chris Christie's big thing is, he was a Republican governor in a Democratic state, obviously. And I think that's it. I think that's the Frankenstein I would put together. I would like to see a governor of a blue state, a red governor of a blue state, that knows how to stay away from the divisive social issues, right? You can be pro-life. That's fine. That's great. I'm pro-life. But that doesn't have to lead your campaign. And there's no reason to talk about it. That's the kind of person that I think can win. Certainly the middle can start to win some of those moderate Democrats. And somebody that believes again in America. This is the big key is, can you be optimistic, recognize the challenges we have, but have an optimistic message, and particularly a message of strong national defense? Because we've become in this country we've sort of quit believing in our ability to do foreign policy, and we're still pretty darn good at it.
Very, 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 very well said. All right, I'm at the point of the podcast, Mr. Author, where I have 5 words after gleaning your book.
Okay.
I have these 5 words that I'm going to read out to you, and then you can have a reaction to you can give me a paragraph or not. When I brought up with Lighthizer as an example, I said the United States, he gave me his rendition. I said, well, I sort of feel like love affair is what I would say about the United States. I feel like people like you, Adam Kinzinger, and Robert Lighthizer have a love affair with the United States.
Right.
So that we're not going to go with that one, but let's talk about democracy.
Yeah, I mean, look, democracy is the hardest form of government in the world. And this is a new revelation that I've had, particularly since January 6th. It is difficult, right? It's the best form, but it's difficult. Why is it difficult? Because you have to have a basic level of trust. And all that trust is that the election counts and that the winner wins. That's it. When that is destroyed, we're in trouble.
Yeah, well, that's the
hardest form of government.
Peaceful transfer of power, which is always impressive to people because 2/3 of the world lives with some level of dictatorship or autocracy. And so in the West, we've been able to make that happen for several hundred years at least. And so hopefully we can continue it. But it's rough out there, my friend. So that's the second word, courage.
Courage is just doing the right thing when it doesn't feel like the right thing. That's what I'd say about courage.
Right. And sometimes not fitting into your tribe, right? Because it's hard. Right. You have to go against the grain of what's easy.
That's right.
If I say the word politics, what do you think of?
Actually, it's a negative feeling now, which makes me a little sad that it is a negative feeling. Because I think it's an honorable profession still. But yeah, I would say right now it just feels broken. That's what I would say to politics.
Okay. Broken. How about the word renegade? It's the title of your book, the word renegade.
Renegade, I would put that with just being willing to tell the tribe no, or to go against the tribe. That's what I would say. Right.
So breaking from the ranks, there's when you say renegade, there's like a fun part of it. I hear maverick in that as well. You know, you're going to break ranks, necessary for that. I think people find
it was a cool 80s TV show too.
Yeah, it was. It was. See, I'm old enough to remember that, but I feel like you have a huge fan base. I'm like many of us, you're probably reading some of the negative tweets about yourself, but you should ignore those. You have a huge fan base. I think people really respect that you're red, white, and blue. That you really want. You believe in the first name of the country, which is United. That's right. It's not the disunited States of America. I mean, when I read your book, that's what came out of it for me. The last word is 2 words, Adam Kinzinger. What would you say about that person?
That's a tough one. How do you describe, what would you say about yourself? I just say like a middle-class kid that happened to be well known for just simply doing the right thing.
Well, that's your middle-class Midwestern modesty. I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit. I was with a buddy of mine this morning at the local diner. So I live in the town that I grew up in. Was a blue-collar town. There's some wealthy people that live on the water, but I live 2 miles from where my parents raised me. So I went to go visit one of my friends at the local diner. And he said to me, we're living in a historic time. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, there's so much craziness out there. We may end up losing the democracy, or we may be able to keep it together. And somebody 25 or 30 years from now will be writing about it, or maybe doing motion pictures about it. And, your name came up. Yeah. And he basically said to me, but then you got guys like Adam Kinzinger who's just really just trying to do the right thing. It's funny you say that. I'm going to be interviewing him today. And, what he said to me, which I'm going to share with you, is he said, tell him I said thank you.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
And so, I mean, there's a lot of gratitude out there for you. And I greatly appreciate you coming on Open Book. Now, I have an ask of you. I hope you'll accept my invitation. I want to bring you back when the election heats up.
Okay.
Just to talk about what's going on and what you see from the political zeitgeist. So you'll be hearing from us if that's okay.
Yeah, anytime. It was great.
All right.
I enjoyed it.
All right, Adam. God bless you. Thank you so much for joining us today on Open Book.
Any of us would want our secrets kept secret, and any of us would want the things we've done wrong in the past buried away forever and no one be able to discuss them. The problem is that the system exists built around the legal system, really, that allows people who accrue that much wealth, an oligarch, the boss of a multinational corporation, whoever it may be, who indulge those desires. That's the problem. If I had that much wealth to do this, to crush scrutiny of myself, the problem is that we've allowed that system to develop that can be used in that way.
Joining us now on Open Book is Tom Burgis. He's an international best-selling author, and he's an award-winning investigative journalist. And what a timely book. The title of this book is Cuckoo Land, Where the Rich Own the Truth. Tom, I mean, this is like probably perhaps the most timely book of the 2024 season, if you will. Myself, my producer, others in my office read the book with great fascination. So thank you for agreeing to come on the show.
Pleasure.
Listen, you've had a phenomenal career. You're a gutsy guy. Tell us a little bit about your start and tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write the book?
Well, it's very nice to be here talking with you. I started as a foreign correspondent. I worked in Latin America, and then I spent several years in Africa. I was based in Johannesburg and then in Lagos, covering West Africa. And more, I found myself writing about corruption and the power of the richest people in the world, which often go hand in hand. So I was looking at the big oil and mining companies. I was looking at the Chinese advance into Africa. I was looking at Russian oligarchs, mining businesses in Africa, and so on. And I was seeing how corruption was the engine of these oil and mining industries that provide the feedstock of the global economy, if you like, from those places we think of as very poor, but are some of the richest in the world in terms of those raw ingredients, those raw materials. And what I started to discover then as a correspondent, and then after that, when I came back to London about a little over 10 years ago and started working as an investigative reporter, was that there's this whole bit of the news business that's completely invisible to anyone other than the journalists and the targets of the journalism. And it's especially acute in London, but it affects journalism all over the world. And that is the ability of the rich to censor the press. So no, I don't mean government censorship. I mean private sector, privatized censorship, if you like, right? Where you can be spending, that's really, really good reporters can be spending a year more unearthing a story that really matters. Some of the ones that I did with some really good reporters were about corruption in the world's poorest places, corruption that was helping to sustain monstrous dictatorships in pursuit of lucrative mineral deals. And time again, before publication, we would come up against incredibly well-equipped, well-funded law firms, PR agencies, sometimes surveillance, and we would never write about any of this. In some cases, this would mean that stories weren't published at all. Stories of massive public importance were just left off the public record. In some cases, it meant that we would have to censor ourselves. It puts incredible pressure on journalists and newsrooms. And essentially, where I ended up with this idea was with this idea, this fear, if you like, that actually, if you are rich enough today, can you just decide what you want reality to be and impose that reality on the world? And then I happened to stumble across the one extraordinary story that became the central tale of Cuckoo Land.
Yeah, I want to get into that story, but I've been dying to ask you this question since I finished your book. What the hell is wrong with these rich people? I mean, I guess I grew up in the, look, I've made some measure of wealth, but I grew up in the middle class, the blue collar middle class. I thought we had a great life. I don't understand why you have to be this rapacious, where you have to rip through everything. You're going to be dead anyway. What the hell is wrong with these people, Tom? Go ahead. What's your insight there?
I think about that question a lot, and actually, there's a bigger question, which is, what's wrong with anyone in certain positions of power? I mean, before I was thinking about rich people, I was thinking about the people who order and carry out massacres in Nigeria, where I used to live, or I was thinking about the oil ministers in Angola who had cut themselves on oil deals, siphoning off money that could have alleviated the poverty in the slums. And now this question, it is the central one. It's one I try to grapple with at the very end of the book, at the very end of Cuckoo Land, of like, what is going on here? What is this motivation that makes people spend huge amounts of money to have a version of themselves broadcast into the world that they want? And now I'd be fascinated to know what you think. Lots of rich people, but I actually think they're no different from the rest of us. I think that anyone wants to broadcast an idealized version of themselves. God knows millions of people spend enough time on Facebook doing exactly that. And any of us would want our secrets kept secret. And any of us would want the things we've done wrong in the past buried away forever and no one be able to discuss them. The problem is that the system exists built around the legal system, really, that allows people who accrue that much wealth, an oligarch, the boss of a multinational corporation, whoever it may be, to indulge those desires. That's the problem. I think that many of us, I'm sure there are a virtuous few. I think if you gave Mandela $1 billion, maybe he wouldn't have done that. But I'm not sure I can declare myself angelic enough not to feel the urge, if I had that much wealth, to do this, to crush scrutiny of myself. The problem is that we've allowed that system to develop that can be used in that way.
Yeah, well, listen, I'll express my humanity to you. I went to work in the White House, all ego-related reasons. I wanted to work for the President of the United States. And even though he was cuckoo land, the definition of him, it happens to be the title of your book, I did it anyway to suit my ego. So I am, like everyone else, I'm very human and I have these sensitivities and these traits. Let's go to a gentleman by the
But
name.
Anthony, could I just actually could I pick
No,
up
no,
something, because
please,
something that
please.
there was a real moment. I actually put it in my previous book, this moment, Kleptopia. It's about how dirty money is conquering the world. There was an extraordinary moment while you were in the White House that I think really illuminates this. And I don't want to get into the huge, vast saga of Trump Russia, but I did write in a previous book about how so much of Trump's wealth came from the former Soviet Union, from really corrupt countries, and that he sort of revived a business career by using his brand as a reality TV star to renting out that brand to people who wanted to be able to pump money into US real estate, no questions asked. Essentially, he was facilitating an alternative reality for people with often very dubious fortunes from the former Soviet Union. And then it's that, I think, that gives us such an insight into how he governed. And there was that, first of all, in the friends he made, his friendliness with other ultra rich people. I put Putin high in this list, who wanted to be able to dominate the truth. But then there's that incredible moment, isn't there, when you talk about the guy who sinks the 3-foot putt, and the next day the White House transcript says, "This is a guy who sinks 30-foot putts." And I thought that was such an electrifying cuckoo land moment. At the time, I hadn't conceived of the book, but actually, looking back, that's an extraordinary moment when you saw the basic rule break down, that we all have to have a certain respect, that some things happened and some things didn't. And that was an extraordinary moment. And I think it's that kind of sense of entitlement to literally rewrite reality that I'm trying to describe.
So it's interesting you bring that up because he does sink those putts, and I also said, just to add insult to injury, I said he threw a 40-yard spiral through a tire, and of course people said I made that up, and so thankfully there was a YouTube video of him doing it at the Buffalo Bills stadium. Because I was present at the time that it happened, and thankfully I was able to find the video. So people thought I was like blowing smoke up his you know what. Okay, now I also saw him hit a foul shot in Madison Square Garden. So the problem is we dislike him because he's a sociopathic liar, but there are elements of his personality and his personage where he does do those things. He is somebody that doesn't choke under pressure. And so I told the truth about those things. A lot of journalists ridiculed me, but thank God there were tapes of actually what I was explaining. So, but
what was extraordinary, wasn't it? It was that even nonetheless, even though you were describing, remarkable, pretty cool things he was able to do, someone decided that he couldn't live with just having putted a 3-foot putt. It had to be 30. And so the transcript was changed. The transcript, the sacrosanct White House transcript was changed.
I didn't realize that the transcript was changed. But you know what I'm sort of flattered by this, Tom. I hope you don't mind me saying this way. That happened 7 years ago. Do you know how many people remember that press conference? And so because all I did was go to the press podium and be myself and answer the questions to the best of my capability. I certainly wasn't going to lie for them. You could read, you could go over the press. That happened 10 years ago on the 21st, I'm sorry, 7 years ago on the 21st of July, 2017. And I've watched it. All I did was try my best of my capability to tell the truth of what I saw.
Yeah, but check that transcript, man. I thought the transcript change was an extraordinary moment. I'm sorry, I took you off on a tangent. I took you off on a memory there, Ben.
I wanted something really good for the country. And I was speaking aspirationally for the country and aspirationally about him. 10 short days after that, and I served 11 days. So it was 10 days after that I got fired. but he doesn't have it in him. I mean, he just does not have it in him. He doesn't have the public service or the public mindedness in him to try to do well for other people. I think ultimately, my life and my reflections on life, you want people in public service that actually like people. You want people in public
Yes.
service that want to serve people. My grandmother had a great expression. I'll share it with you, Tom. The best among us choose not to judge human frailty so harshly. And so we recognize in our humanity, we have frailty. And so therefore, let's not be overly judgmental of each other, but in fact, try to help each other through whatever the problems we have. He is the antithesis of that, unfortunately.
And I think, though, I think that's a beautiful expression, but I think, and this is again something I try to grapple with so much in Cuckoo Land, is that we do have to be able to judge each other's character. That's kind of the basis of a free society, right? To be able to make honest, yes, humane, but honest appraisals of each other's character and each other's fitness for office and responsibility. And that's what this system of essentially bullying or intimidation by force of wealth via lawyers and spies and so on, that's what that shuts down. And that is essentially the difference between a free society and an unfree one, whether or not we can scrutinize those who wield power effectively through the media or through any other means.
So I want to get into that, if you don't mind, because there's
Sure.
a fascinating character in your book. Hopefully I'm pronouncing his name right, Muhammad al-Mursi.
Yeah.
So I want people to read your book, and I don't want to give a spoiler alert about the book, but what a story this is. So give us the high notes of who he is, what he did, what the perpetration was, your response to it, and what does it tell you about the very wealthy?
Well, Muhammad al-Mursi, an intriguing man. I first heard about him actually when I was in the middle of being sued by some oligarchs myself who didn't like my previous book and wanted it. I've never quite figured out what actually how they want books destroyed, either burned or pulped or whatever it might be. But anyway, taken off the shelves. And then I heard about this other case that was going on in the UK, the capital of privatized censorship, and it was that of a major donor to the Conservative Party. Isn't at the moment, but tends to be in power here, and this major donor had employed the most ferocious of the London reputation management law firms, Carter Ruck. And the firm on his behalf was sending threatening letters to a former MP, Charlotte Leslie, saying that she had done something unforgivable and appalling. And what she had done is she'd written a memo that, among other things, had raised a few questions about where does this rich donor, Muhammad al-Mursi's money come from? And he was having none of this. He thought she was getting in the way of his big ambitions. And I thought, first of all, this is an extraordinary example, isn't it, of wealth being deployed in the service of the narrative that the rich wish to prevail. But also I thought, if you're prepared to go to such lengths to shut down even a little bit of scrutiny, I wonder what that past is. And that's where I set off. And that road then took me, well, the war in Ukraine started, so I couldn't go back to Russia by then, but it took me through contacts back into the past of Putin's St. Petersburg, and then on to elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, other places where Mercy had made huge amounts of money. So he'd made money in Russia, and then it was Kazakhstan, there was Uzbekistan. I went to Nepal, to Kathmandu, to track down on the trail of a Nepali oligarch that Mercy had done business with, all in the booming telecoms industry. And then there comes this moment where he's made his money, and about 10 years ago he transforms into something else. He transforms into a pillar of the British establishment, and he does this with the help of the nephew of the now Queen. And there's this extraordinary sort of metamorphosis into a philanthropist, a donor to Oxford University, a donor to the Conservative Party, a man for whom no door in the land from the Prime Minister down is ever closed. And what I tried to do is simply to tell his story and the truth of his story, how he made his money, how he wrote his own story, and how in the British political and social system, no one wants to ask questions about where the money came from.
You know, it's fascinating because we we interviewed the author of The Butler to the World and the whole story of London being a great center
Right,
of money
Oliver
laundering.
Bullough, great guy.
Yeah, Oliver's a great guy, and so we interviewed him to talk about this money laundering, and we also know from the global financial crisis that the drug lords around the world propped up the banking system with their illegal money sluicing through the marketplace and supposedly being laundered by the banks and offering some level of reserve protection. So is it just that we're flawed? Is it just that we're going to always have some seamy people in our societies that are doing these things, and our governments are, for whatever reason, going to turn a blind eye?
I think it's a constant struggle, isn't it? I think that the way political funding has gone, certainly in the US, and it's heading that way, I think more and more in Europe, means that the incentives are all wrong. So those who rule in our name are supposed to do that, right? Rule in our name. But and we can still scrutinize politicians pretty effectively in the press, whether the sort of traditional mainstream press or in newer forms. Try to scrutinize the people who fund politics. Try to scrutinize the people who pay for access, who get to shape the policies of governments, and you're likely to get terrifying legal letter. I think you're right that to an extent there's always going to be people who are, for whatever reasons, a combination of self-importance and vanity, and sometimes more sinister reasons, are trying to worm their way into politics. I would just say, though, that this is becoming like a big national security problem as well, in that the channels, I mean, in the US it's very familiar through Citizens United and so on, like the channels to influence the powerful are so unpoliced that it's been recognized in the UK that this is wide open to malign influence by whether it's Putin's regime or whichever other hostile state. And yet it's in the interests of the ruling class, if you like. It's in the interests of those who profit politically from hoovering up this money, no questions asked, to continue not to ask any questions. And it's completely antithetical to the democratic spirit, right? I think that's what's ultimately so terrifying about it, is that it's insulating the most powerful people from the scrutiny that we really need to impose on them if we're going to have healthy societies. And that's what I found with the Mercy story, when I end up in a room in a law firm being screamed at by him, and I get this sense, man to man, of the rage, the wrath of someone who is so rich that they think that only their version of reality should be told.
So we have a person in our midst. He's worth about $200 billion. He spent $44 billion on Twitter. He renamed it X. He's got several 100 million followers. Obviously, he's opened up the spigot of the algorithm so that he can reach, I don't know. I mean, you tell me, that's half the population of Europe if you got 250 million followers, right? So, 2/3 of the United States. And he's politically active. And he's pretty supportive of Donald Trump at this point, even though Donald Trump derogated him during the administration and said all kinds of mean and nasty things about him. He's in the Trump camp. What do you make of the psychology of all this? I mean, you're right about it. So just share with me what you think of the psychology of these people in terms of how they're thinking about things, why they're doing what they're doing. As an example, he says he's for free speech. He hired Don Lemon, a hard left guy who's openly gay African American. He had a bad interview with him. He fired him summarily. So what do you think of all this?
I think we touched on this earlier when we said that I think any of us, there's this great expression. I think I know it from William Burroughs, actually. It says, "Wouldn't you?" I think he's talking about heroin addiction, but anyone given enough power is going to indulge their worst impulses, I think. And this is the problem. The gradually, over several decades, the winnowing away of the constraints on the powerful, right? Especially those whose power comes from wealth. What's the psychology at play? Well, I was able to see Mercy very close up for a long time, sometimes in person, sometimes by speaking to people who knew him. And I think part of it is a desire for an age-old desire for status, right? For praise, for recognition, for being seen as the good guy, right? Nobody wants to be the nobody. I went back to a passage in Orwell recently when he writes fascinatingly about, the what he calls the lords of property and their hired liars, and how, on any side of any war, on any side of partisan politics, you're going to find people who are simply trying to amass personal influence. And maybe partly Orwell said it's to not be forgotten. You mentioned at the beginning about, you can't take any of this with you. But I think, in a sense, it's a hedge against death, isn't it? There's a desperate desire not to be one of the almost everybody whose name will be completely lost to history.
Yeah, well, this is the whole thing with the art world. The art is immortal, or at least perception-wise. Da Vinci's paintings, we can see them from 500 years ago, and they're still with us, his expression of his genius. And so people want to capture that and put it on their walls. They think it's going to create more permanence.
But these are works of art, aren't we? We're talking about work. We're talking about constructed. We're not talking about real people, right? We're talking about the image that they and their, as Orwell would say, hired liars create. And that almost is a work of art they want to be hanging on lots of people's walls after they're gone. I think maybe fundamentally there's something like that going on.
Yeah. Your other brilliant book is called Kleptopia and the Looting Machine. Tell us a little bit about that book as well, because I have to confess I haven't read that, but I just purchased it and I look forward to reading it.
So I started with the Looting Machine. I came back from Africa I mentioned it earlier, obsessed with one massacre that had taken place in Nigeria that I had covered, and was a nightmare. And I tried to understand how the huge forces of corruption and behind that of the global oil industry that dominates Nigeria, how you get from those huge forces down to that one burned village. And after that, I started looking more at that was the Looting Machine, really, was an account of oil and mining and how it begets corruption and conflict in Africa today, the modern plunder of Africa. And then I started to look at that more globally, this idea that corrupt money, dirty money that is made by holding power one way or another, that's a public trust, and corruptly monetizing that for personal gain. So that, the king of that is Putin, but there's plenty of characters doing that in New York and London too. And that was Kleptopia, how dirty money is conquering the world. And that's several stories all woven together, in including some of the rise of Donald Trump and the money he absorbed from the former Soviet Union. And the idea there is to show that the biggest and most terrifying force against freedom today is these international networks of kleptocrats, right, of those who rule from corruption. And particular networks can combine a Zimbabwean dictator, a Kazakh oligarch, and a Wall Street hedge fund. And they are all privatizing power, if you like it. So that's Kleptopia. And that began with a chance meeting with an extraordinary, mischievous man called Nigel, who had worked inside a Swiss bank and had secretly copied lots of the documents and hidden them in little red boxes in his flat. And that led me on this extraordinary journey through the world of dirty money. And in a way, that gets you to Cuckoo Land, I think, because it was through this process I was just seeing again and again the extent to which, unbeknown to any readers, unbeknown to the readers of newspapers and books and the listeners of podcasts, there's this huge unseen force deciding what we can and can't know.
It's fascinating. So we're at a point in our podcast. We like to make these about 30 or so minutes. We've called 5 words from your book, and so I'm going to read the words to you. It's a little name association. You tell me what you think of when I say this to you.
Okay.
So let's start with the word kleptocracy. When I say that word, will you think of what?
This is an interesting game. I think that a lot of people instantly go to the big yacht, right? The fancy yacht, in off the south of France, and actually, I what I'm picturing is a woman I once spoke to in Kazakhstan. I snuck into a village in Kazakhstan where there had been a massacre, and the survivors of the peaceful protest that had been shot up, they were tortured so that they would give the version of reality that the kleptocrat wanted. Nazarbayev, the ruling kleptocrat of Kazakhstan, he wanted reality to be the opposite of what it had been. He wanted the protesters to have been responsible for the massacre, not his security forces. And I won't go into now the techniques of torture that were used, but they were hideous, hellish. And that's what I think of kleptocracy, is that people will steal anything and everything down to stealing people's innermost dignity.
All right, I love that. That's why I asked the question. How about dirty money? I say the words dirty money. You say what?
Everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. Including, you're sitting in New York, right?
I live in New York. Yeah, I'm in New York.
Yeah. I mean, we think of dirty money, we think of Putin and his like solid gold toilet, and we might think of a Nigerian governor, and certainly we should think of London as a huge engine of dirty money, but possibly the biggest sink for dirty money ever is New York real estate.
All right, so money and dirtiness is everywhere. I say the word corruption, also everywhere, but what else would you say about corruption?
Trust. I'd say trust is what is the opposite of corruption. And it's often hard to define, and we can get very legalistic about it. But corruption is essentially when a group of people have bestowed their trust on someone, could be a president, could be a school principal, and that trust is betrayed for personal gain, then we're breaking the most basic bonds of human society. And we shouldn't get too caught up in the huge complexity of front companies and Swiss bank accounts and so on. That's ultimately what we're talking about. And that's why the huge spread of it since the end of the Cold War is so dangerous, because it eats away at that. And that's the heart of what we have and what we are, right? You imagine a world where that trust had finally fatally fallen apart.
Yeah, no question. How about, I say the word rich. You say what?
Doesn't make you happy necessarily. I mean, you were talking earlier about your upbringing. I think I think maybe more, sometimes I actually it takes me back to, it's kind of often more money, more problems, right? I remember when I was living in Nigeria and I would meet the children of magnificently corrupt politicians. No, nothing inherently Nigerian about corruption. It's just a system run on oil gets really corrupt, doesn't matter where you do it. And these kids were rich, were really, really rich. They had everything you could want. And I've seen Kazakh kids like this too. I'm talking sort of teenagers. But the psychological tension of having to occupy the lie that your wealth is legitimate, and knowing, if you've got any sense, by your mid-teens, that your father and mother stole everything that you have, and as you walk down the streets, you can see open sewers and kids dying for lack of basic medicine. I've known a few people through my work in that situation, and I really pity them, actually.
It's so fascinating, and I'll tell this story briefly. My first job as a lawyer, I went to law school, and I was in between my first and second year, and I was working for a lawyer, and he was a rich guy, and I was in his backyard at his swimming pool, and he was in his 60s, which I am now, and he said, I don't really, this is ridiculous. I spent all my time and energy to make all this stuff. All I really want to do is have a bowl of pasta and watch television. And then I laughed at him and I derided him. And I said, oh, that's because you're rich. I don't have any money. And so you're saying that now, but, that's because you're rich. And then he cursed me, Tom Burgis. He cursed me. It's someday you're going to have money and you're going to think of what I just said and you're going to know what I said was true.
And is it?
And it is. And yes, it is true. Yes, it is. The more simple you are, the less attachments you have to material goods, the happier you are. There's a great paradox to this. There's a great irony to this. Well, I'm not talking about
Yeah,
having enough money to have some financial security and some safety and potentially help you with your health and things like that. But I'm talking about the trappings of wealth don't necessarily make you happy.
I think you're spot on there. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Last one. You ready? I'm going to say the word truth. You say what?
Fragile. So
Yeah.
fragile. So this is the thing that
Interesting.
I often find. I mean, maybe I'm not I'm not a writer of the stat. I think I saw you had Steve Coll on recently. So there's someone who, my God, can think all the way through to the end. I often find that I have my best ideas about my books just shortly after they're published, which can be
Mm-hmm.
frustrating. But the but and sometimes that ends up being the germ of the next one. But
Yeah.
I'm really struck by how fragile the truth is, and how actually bizarre this idea is. It comes back to what you were saying earlier about Elon Musk. The the idea that there are facts out there that are independent. They don't care what we want them to be. They are what they are. In fact, they're completely and utterly indifferent to us, as the universe surely is. And the idea that we would go and seek those facts, not knowing whether they're going to be for our benefit or not, actually, not knowing whether this is real. There's a real freedom in that, I find. But also that idea, like the scientific method, I guess you'd call it, the scientific principle, that there are objective facts. We'll never quite get there because there will always be some aspect of it beyond our understanding, or certainly beyond our current understanding. But that's the idea. That's what animates good science and good journalism and just good curiosity in life. That is a beautiful idea, but it's so fragile because by definition it's in no one's interest. So as you have, I thought you spoke really brilliantly about Musk earlier and what he's doing. You know, as our tools of information become vehicles for the interest of their owners more and more, then and as I tried to write in Cuckoo Land, as the rich or those with enough money can shut down certain areas of public interest inquiry, that idea is more and more imperiled. I was incredibly struck recently by Chinese efforts to have respected scientific journals retract COVID research. I thought that was a huge moment. There's good New York Times reporting on that, where this little precious space we have that we can call the truth or our best attempt at it is incredibly fragile. That's what Kukulan tries to reach towards, and I can't think really of a more important subject at the moment.
Well, listen, we're in a post-truth society, obviously, and so you're writing brilliantly about it. The title of the book is Cuckoo Land, Where the Rich Own the Truth. It's written by Tom Burgis, and it is a great honor for me to have you on my podcast. And I know you'll be writing another book. I want you to come back.
Oh, I'd love to. And the honor is entirely mine. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's been brilliant to have you on. Thank you again.